So let's take a look at another example of observational research. This was a study that looked at interactions between parents and children in a science museum. So one characteristic of this study that's kind of interesting is that the researchers did actually gain consent from the parents before they participated in this thing. And the researchers had little hidden cameras mounted around a bunch of the different exhibits at this museum. And I'm guessing that the fact that they were recording children is why they got consent, because that can be that can raise a lot of concerns. Like, what are you going to do with these recordings of children? Even more so than recordings of adults in natural environments. And it also allowed the researchers to give stickers to people, to the parents, that they could put on the children that identified the date and the age of the child, things like that, that they could later use when they were coding the video recordings that were taken. But again, that is really unusual, because you would be concerned, perhaps, that the knowledge that they're being recorded throughout this visit would lead them to act differently. We've talked about those types of effects before as well. And I think that about 90% of the people ended up saying, yes, I'm fine with being recorded. And I can't remember all the details of this one, but I would imagine that if people didn't want to participate, it wasn't that they were denied entry to the museum, but the children didn't have a sticker on, so the researchers knew that they just wouldn't use that data from the recordings. And so let's see. And they also used event sampling. So they didn't just observe every single interaction between the parents and the children throughout their time in the museum. They were only interested in specific types of interactions between the parents and the children at the exhibits. And they wanted to see whether parents would be, they wanted to see when parents would explain the exhibits to their children, and if there were any sex differences in here. Bless you. And we'll get to look at the results from this in just a second. But they also calculated inter-observer agreement, and this is pretty good for inter-observer agreement. About 86% of the time, the observers, when they were coding these videos, agreed on the behavior that were observed. You're never going to have perfect inter-observer agreement, especially with a large sample. And I think they were recording this data for most of a year. So this was a really big study. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the results here. Now, sorry if this text is a little bit small, but on the vertical axis here we have the percent of interactions where the parents explained how the exhibit works to the child. And then these columns are divided up into which parent was present, whether the fathers were present, whether the mothers were present, and whether both were present. The darker bars are data for boys, and the lighter bars are data for girls. And then they also have it divided up by the age of the youngest child. Right? So there's a clear pattern that's coming into play here. How would you describe these research results? Yeah. That when the parents were with the children looking at these exhibits, they were far more likely to explain how the exhibits worked to their sons than to their daughters. Okay? And so this is going to be a major concern if you are a fan of equality and equal opportunity for boys and girls for going into any field that they want to, because it means that these parents are apparently biased somehow and think that, well, it's hard to make generalizations about how they think, but just based on their behavior, they're not really explaining these exhibits to their daughters nearly as much as they are their sons, and that's it's not just that fathers do this, explain to their sons, and mothers explain to their daughters. Both mothers and fathers explain far more to their sons than to their daughters. Right? There might be a little interaction there, but the sex difference is what the researchers were really focused on. So, any questions about that one? All right. And so again, this is useful information because it's happening out in the real world. This isn't some artificial environment. This is how parents are really acting with their children in these museums. Now, one final example of observational research that we'll talk about today, we'll look at a structured observational study. Now, this is typically done when the researchers are interested in a specific type of behavior that tends to be pretty rare. And it can be just about any rare behavior. The example we're going to look at observed helping behavior. And so in a structured observational study, the researchers will set up a situation in which the participants have the opportunity to perform some behavior that would otherwise be relatively rare. And I think that they did some pilot work for this and found that if they were to just go out and watch these children all day, they might only see 1 or 2 instances of helping behavior. And so that's going to take a lot of time and resources. So this can be a nice way around that. Now, they use something, you might get a kick out of this, they use something called the super suit. And so when these children were engaged in free play, they were given a smock that was essentially like a Superman suit that had a big red star on the front of it, and it's just like a little costume. But the catch is that the smock is designed in such a way that it has to be buttoned at the back of the neck. So they put it on, over the sleeves around the front, and then they have to button it in the back of the neck. And children usually aren't too good at this, and so they require the help of a second person in order to actually put this thing on. And then they trade off. Each child is supposed to have it for a few minutes during the play session. And they want to see, will the children actually ask for help? Will other children spontaneously offer to help when they see that the one that's trying to put on the supersuit is having difficulty with this button? So there, again, you have this clear situation with a specific need for help that's been introduced. Right? And so they studied the behavior and developed inter-observer ratings for 2 different categories of helping. You need to go back? Sure. Sorry about that. But these helping studies are pretty interesting. There have been quite a few of these coming out of the field of social psychology, where they'll set up some situation with a person in distress and then see if bypassers will actually help that person. Okay. So as I was saying, they looked at inter-observer reliability for 2 different categories of helping. They measured spontaneous helping. So when the children saw this child who's putting on the smock struggling with the button, do they spontaneously go over there and offer, hey, let me help you with that button? And they looked at helping when it was actually requested. And the child said, hey, I'm having trouble with this button, can you help me out? And they essentially just wanted to see how often the children would help. And are children helpful, or are they more selfish? And the results indicated that the children did engage in a reasonable amount of helping behavior, but the helpers weren't usually reinforced. So if help was requested and then a child came over and said, oh, here you go, the child that had requested the help just went on to play and didn't actually say thank you or anything like that. And even when children spontaneously went over and said, "Let me help you with that button in the back of the neck," the little kids that were receiving the help didn't reinforce that behavior, didn't actually thank them. And I think they might have looked at the behavior of the teachers too that were in charge of observing these children on a daily basis, and the teachers didn't provide any reinforcement either. So kids do help a little bit on their own, but they're usually not rewarded for it. So any questions about this study? All right. So that's about it for today. We're finished a couple minutes early. So I'll see some of you on Wednesday and some of you in lab.